And that's America. That's you and me. And you say, oh, that's not me. But everyone in here has that secret that they probably haven't told anyone, or they've only told one person, or they're keeping inside of themselves. And there's a couple more, as I said, printed in your bulletin there that I didn't read. And so this is America. This is people keep all these secrets, and you encounter them every day. But they have those smiles. You know, you go into the sheets, and there's that woman smiling there at the desk. What's her backstory? You don't think about that. But let's push this a little further. You're on the internet, pornography, looking at women, looking at men, whatever. What's their backstory? How did they get there? What's the hurt in their life? You don't think about that. Think about people. Now that we know, okay, there's all this hurt going on, well, who really is God? I mean, is He... A lot of times people tend to think, well, there's this Old Testament God, and there's Jesus, the New Testament God, and I don't see how those relate. Because they go, okay, Jesus, always all this love and all that. And in the Old Testament, He's like, okay, this is, He's all these wars, there's all this stuff. God is like, wants to kill everyone, struck this person dead and that person dead. And you're like, oh, this doesn't even make any sense. How is this the same God? How is it the Trinity, And it starts to get confusing. And so today, I want to talk to you about Abraham. And the main verse that we're going to talk about, well, one of the verses is Genesis 12:1 up here. The Lord had said to Abram, leave your country, your people, and your father's household, and go to the land that I will show you. And so, I mean, think about what that would be like. I mean, he was actually pretty old, but first of all, you have to realize that back then they lived to be pretty old. I don't know how old, does anyone know how old Abraham lived total? Pastor Mel, maybe? Yeah, I don't know either. So I don't know how many years, but they lived to be hundreds of years old. And so when he was 75, he left his home. And he was living with his father and his wife. They were all living together in the same house at this time. But, I mean, he was probably living with his father his whole life for 75 years of his life. So picture living with your father for that long, your family, and then suddenly God says, okay, you're going to leave your father's household, you're going to leave your people, and you're just going to go to this land I will show you. Don't even worry about where it is. It's just going to be a surprise. It's over here. Just start walking. So you just, just think about, that would just be, how many people would actually just okay, just start walking out their door and let God direct them where to go? That would be kind of a scary thing. Well, today we just want to, with this new service and everything, we want to just go where God will show us. And that means that Pastor Mel will be speaking next week and for a while on some different things about Abraham. And, well, I'm speaking up here as well. We're not standing up here and saying, we have all the answers, we know all this stuff, and we're up here to tell you everything that we know. That's not the point. The point is for all of us to discover together kind of who is God, who is Jesus, and then once we figure that out, what do they want us to do? What do they want us to do with this life that we have? These 70-some years, maybe more on this earth. So let's start by looking into a different passage about Abraham. Genesis 22:1 through 12 is printed here in the notes section. You can read along, and it skips a couple verses there. But we'll read what's in the bulletin here. It says, sometime later, God tested Abraham. He said to him, Abraham, here I am, he replied. Then God said, take your son, your only son, Isaac, whom you love, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains that I will tell you about. When they reached the place God had told him about, Abraham built an altar there and arranged the wood on it. He bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on top of wood. Then he reached out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. But the angel of the Lord called out to him from heaven, Abraham, Abraham. Here I am, he replied. Do not lay a hand on the boy, he said. Do not do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God, because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son. And if we were to have print more, what happens after that is he says, well, now there's a goat over here, and sacrifice that. There was a ram. It was a ram stuck in the thicket. Its horns were stuck in the thicket. And he says, sacrifice this now on top of this altar. And so we have that story there. And a lot of the times we kind of read that story and pastors read that in church and we stop at one of the points, which I still believe this is a point, but I don't think it's the main point, which is the moral of the story. Abraham was faithful to God, and so should we be too. We should be faithful to God because Abraham was faithful. And I think that's a point that the story is trying to relate. But we kind of just stop there, and no one ever kind of thinks about or talks about. It's kind of disturbing, I mean, in the way that God actually says, go kill your son, first off, and then second off, Abraham doesn't say, wait a minute, what are you talking about, or anything like that. He just, if you would see verse 3, he just basically went. There was no protests or anything. And like Moses with the burning bush, he said, no, I have a stuttering problem, I can't do that. Moses had all these excuses. He didn't even, it was his own son being about to be killed by himself. And he just went and did it. And why wasn't he surprised about that? It seems really confusing. Well, as I said, I went to Geneva College. And at Geneva, I took this class called How to Read the Bible with Terry Thomas was his name. And some people may be familiar with Terry Thomas. And at first you go in, like, how to read the Bible. A whole semester's worth of how to read the Bible. And there's this book you have to read about how to read the Bible. And it's just like, what? What do you mean how to read the Bible? You just open it, you read this, okay? But what you start to learn real quickly in a class like that or anything like that, you start to learn that it helps a lot when you understand the background and the history and the context of what was happening around the time that the story was happening. Because, the people who wrote this, the historian that wrote this story, which would have been Moses, who wrote this story, didn't write it thinking, all these people are going to be reading this, so I better explain the backstory. They didn't. Someone was asking me this the other day. Did the people go and say, well, this is going to be in the Bible? They didn't know that it would be in the Bible. They were writing a book that God told them to write, but they didn't know that it was going to be called the Bible. And so they weren't, I don't think Moses was sitting there thinking about us in the future, like, okay, we're going to read about this. So he was writing to the people that already knew about all this stuff, and already knew that this stuff was going on, so they would read this and they would know. And so the rabbis in Jesus' day, they knew what this was talking about, and they would explain to everybody, and it was a pretty common view about what this passage was about. And that is that in this day of Abraham, there were many gods that people would worship, and a god for everything. And for instance, if there was no rain and you were a farmer, then you knew that the rain god must be angry, and the rain god demanded a sacrifice. And so you'd say, okay, well, here's a tenth of my crops, and you'd go burn them up on this altar. And then you'd be like, okay, now I hope the rain god is happy. And then you'd wait like a week or something, or a couple days, depending on how bad it was. And then the rain god must still be very angry. So you'd have to get something. He must not have been happy with that, so I got to get something bigger. So, okay, what's bigger than that? And you keep getting bigger and bigger until you have people like in the Bible, like the people who worship Baal, who it talks about were just cutting themselves and letting their blood go on the altar. And there are even stories about this group of people who followed a particular god that as soon as their firstborn babies were born, they would take their babies and throw them on the fire and burn up their babies and kill their firstborn babies for the gods. And so it was very commonplace held belief back then in this era that the gods were always demanding things, that you had to give the gods things to make them happy. And if you didn't, then bad things would happen. So you always had to be giving the gods things. And so we enter into that entire world in this story of Abraham.